D-Day. Just saying the words brings up images of chaos, heroism, and unimaginable sacrifice. It was June 6, 1944, and the fate of Europe hung in the balance. The Allies launched the largest amphibious assault in history, aiming to break Hitler's stranglehold on the continent. 5 beaches stretched along the Normandy coast, each with its own code name, its own challenges, but none would be as brutal, as bloody, or as critical as Omaha Beach. This wasn't just a battle. It was a desperate gamble, a knife-edge moment where the entire invasion could have crumbled. The strategic importance was immense. If Omaha fell, the entire D-Day operation risked unraveling, leaving hundreds of thousands of men trapped and vulnerable. It was a place where ordinary men would face extraordinary horrors. Among those ordinary men was Sergeant Henry Mitchell. He wasn't a towering figure, nor did he possess a booming voice that commanded attention. Henry was from a small town in Ohio, a quiet young man who'd spent his pre-war years working at his father's hardware store, meticulously organizing nuts and bolts. He joined the army not out of a thirst for glory, but from a quiet sense of duty. He believed in doing what was right, even when it was hard. His training had been thorough, if unremarkable. He was a good shot, knew his tactics, and possessed a calm demeanor that often masked an iron will. There was a quiet determination about him, a steady resolve that few noticed, but which ran deep. He wasn't the kind of guy who sought the spotlight, preferring to get the job done without fuss. The journey across the English Channel was a blur of cramped quarters and nervous anticipation. The air in the landing craft was thick with the smell of diesel, sweat, and fear. Men sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces grim, some trying to sleep, others staring blankly ahead. The rhythmic thrum of the engines was a constant, unsettling reminder of their destination. Henry gripped his rifle, its cold metal a familiar comfort against his gloved hands. He thought about home, about the smell of his mother's apple pie, about the simple life he'd left behind. He knew what was coming, or at least, he thought he did. No training exercise could truly prepare them for the reality of what lay ahead. The psychological pressure was immense, a heavy blanket pressing down on every man, every breath. Jokes were few and far between now, replaced by a tense silence punctuated by the occasional cough or whispered prayer. Then, through the gray morning mist, they saw it. The French coastline. It looked deceptively peaceful at first, a long stretch of sand backed by low bluffs. But Henry knew better. He'd studied the maps, seen the aerial reconnaissance photos. Those bluffs were bristling with German defenses, concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, and artillery batteries, all zeroed in on the beach. As they drew closer, the illusion of peace shattered. The deafening roar began, a symphony of destruction. Naval guns from the Allied fleet pounded the shore, answered by sharp cracks and concussions from German cannons. Tracer fire arced across the sky, a deadly light show. The impossible odds became terrifyingly real. The landing craft shuddered violently as it hit the sand. The ramp, a heavy steel plate, began to lower with a grinding groan. It felt like an eternity, each inch revealing more of the hell that awaited them. As the ramp finally dropped, it was like opening a door directly into a hurricane of lead. Machine gun fire ripped through the air, spitting death. Men in front of Henry fell instantly, their bodies collapsing into the icy water. The overwhelming sense of vulnerability was immediate, suffocating. There was no cover, nowhere to hide. Just open sand, a wall of bullets, and the desperate primal instinct to move, to survive. This was it. The desperate struggle had begun. The ramp fully down, the beach became a slaughterhouse. Soldiers, fresh out of the landing craft, barely had time to register their surroundings before they were cut down. The air was thick with the whiz of bullets, the sharp crack of rifles, and the constant, terrifying thud of mortar rounds impacting the sand. German machine guns, positioned in concrete emplacements high on the bluffs, poured down an unrelenting, overlapping stream of fire. It wasn't just individual shots. It was a wall of lead, tearing through flesh and bone. The water near the shore turned red, stained by the blood of the fallen. Bodies piled up at the water's edge, forming gruesome, makeshift barriers. The meticulously planned invasion was, in these first moments, a catastrophic failure. The sheer volume of incoming fire was beyond anything they had trained for. Henry's unit disintegrated almost instantly. The sergeant who had been shouting orders moments before took a direct hit, and the sergeant who had been shouting orders moments before took a direct hit and crumpled into the surf, his last breath a gurgle of blood. Another, a corporal Henry knew well, screamed as his leg was torn away by shrapnel. Communication dissolved into a cacophony of agony and machine gun chatter. Men were frozen, pinned down by the sheer volume of fire, some clutching wounds, others simply staring blankly at the chaos, their minds unable to process the horror. Despair was a tangible thing, settling over the beach like a shroud. Every instinct screamed to retreat, to curl into a ball and wait for the end. The soundscape was a nightmare, the endless stutter of German MG-42s, the distant boom of naval guns, the closer, terrifying whistle of incoming mortar rounds, and the constant, desperate cries for medics that no one could reach. Amidst this hell, a strange calm settled over Henry. He saw the tactical problem, not just the terror. They were stuck, exposed, and dying. He watched the German positions, trying to pinpoint the source of the most devastating fire. He noticed a slight dip in the terrain, a barely perceptible rise in the sand that offered a fraction more cover, and a disabled landing craft further down the beach that might provide a temporary shield. His mind, trained to observe and react, began to work, pushing past the paralyzing fear. A flicker of resolve ignited within him. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about doing something, anything, to break this death trap. He looked around, seeing small groups of isolated, shell-shocked soldiers, huddled behind whatever meager cover they could find. They were from different units, their officers likely dead or incapacitated, their faces etched with shock and despair. Henry, without thinking about his rank or authority, began to move. He crawled, low and fast, through the shallow water and sand, shouting over the din, not orders, but simple, urgent words. "This way! Follow me! There's cover!" His voice, though not loud, carried a surprising authority, a clarity that cut through the noise. He pointed towards the disabled landing craft, a beacon of sorts in the madness. Slowly, hesitantly, a few heads turned. A young private, his eyes wide with terror, nodded slightly and began to crawl towards him. Then another and another. Henry didn't wait for them all. He had a rudimentary plan, born of desperation and a quick scan of the terrain. They needed to move, to gain even a few yards inland, to get past the immediate killing zone. He pointed to the slight rise in the sand, then to the disabled craft. "We move in rushes, 3 at a time. Keep low," he yelled, his voice strained but firm. He took the lead, pushing himself forward, exposing himself to the relentless fire. He moved not with recklessness, but with a calculated speed, using the briefest lulls in machine gun fire. The bullets kicked up sand all around him, but he kept going, setting the example. The small group, now numbering about 7 or 8 men, followed. It was a perilous advance, a crawl of inches under a sky of lead. One man near him cried out as a bullet grazed his arm, but he kept moving, driven by the sheer will of Henry's direction. This was a small, tactical victory, a desperate push. But it was movement, and movement meant a sliver of hope. They encountered a stretch of barbed wire, almost invisible in the churned sand. It seemed an impossible barrier. "Spread out! Cut it!" Henry yelled, pulling a pair of wire cutters from his belt. Others, seeing his initiative, found their own cutters or used bayonets, hacking frantically at the coiled metal. The exposed moments felt like an eternity, but they worked with a desperate intensity. Finally, a narrow path was cleared. They squeezed through, leaving shreds of uniform and skin on the barbs. But they were through, The disabled landing craft offered a momentary sanctuary, a steel shield against the torrent of bullets. Gasping for breath, their bodies aching, the small group huddled behind it. It wasn't safe, not really, but it was better than the open beach. For the first time in what felt like hours, they had a brief respite. Henry looked back at the carnage, then up at the bluffs, his mind already working on the next impossible step. They had gained a few yards, but the real fight, the climb up the bluffs, still lay ahead. From their precarious shelter behind the wrecked landing craft, Henry raised his head cautiously. The roar of battle still filled the air, but from this new, slightly elevated position, he gained a better view of the German defenses dominating the bluffs above. They weren't just a distant threat anymore. They were a looming, concrete reality, bristling with machine gun nests and artillery emplacements. He knew with a cold certainty that as long as those positions remained active, the men still pinned on the beach were as good as dead. The beach itself was a killing field, and the only way to clear it was to silence the guns on the heights. He studied the cliffs, his eyes scanning for anything that wasn't a solid wall of rock and concrete. Most of it looked impenetrable, a sheer climb under constant fire. But then, almost hidden by some sparse brush and the angle of the terrain, he spotted it. A narrow gully, barely more than a deep crease in the bluff face. It wasn't completely out of sight from the German positions, but it looked less exposed than the open face of the cliff. Maybe, just maybe, it had been overlooked, or deemed too insignificant to heavily fortify. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only path he could see that offered even a remote chance of success. Turning to the small group of exhausted, shell-shocked soldiers huddled around him, Henry knew his next task would be even harder than leading them across the sand. The idea of climbing that bluff, after everything they had just endured, seemed suicidal. Their faces were grim, their eyes hollow. They had just survived hell, and he was asking them to walk into another. "Look," he said, his voice low but firm, pointing towards the gully. "We can't stay here, and we can't go back. Those guns up there, they're killing everyone on the beach. If we don't take them out, this whole thing is over." He paused, letting his words sink in. "That gully, it's our only way up. It's dangerous, probably crawling with Germans, but it's a chance. The only chance we have to make a difference." A few murmurs, some shaking heads. One private, no older than 18, looked at him with despair. "Sergeant, we're done. We can't." Henry cut him off, not unkindly, but with an urgency that left no room for argument. "We can, and we will. We go up that gully, we take out whatever we find, and we open a path for the others. Stay here, and we die slowly. Go up, and we might just save this whole damn invasion." His conviction, his quiet determination, seemed to cut through their fear. Slowly, reluctantly, they nodded. They were with him. The climb was brutal. The gully was steeper and more treacherous than it had looked from below, a mix of loose rock, mud, and sparse, thorny bushes. Every few steps someone would slip, sending a cascade of pebbles down, threatening to give away their position. Henry led the way, testing each foothold, pulling himself up with raw strength and sheer willpower. The constant threat of discovery hung heavy in the air. They moved in agonizing slow motion, their hands scraped, their uniforms torn. The sounds of German voices, distant but distinct, drifted down from above, making their hearts pound. They hugged the sides of the gully, trying to blend with the shadows and the uneven terrain. The physical exertion was immense, but the mental strain was worse. Every rustle of leaves, every distant shout, sent a jolt of adrenaline through them. They were deep behind enemy lines now, though still technically on the beachhead. They knew one wrong move, one loud noise, and it would all be over. They were a small, desperate band, crawling inch by agonizing inch towards an unknown fate, but with a shared, unspoken understanding. Failure was not an option. As they neared the top, the sounds of German conversation grew clearer. the metallic clatter of weapons unmistakable. They were almost there. The real fight was about to begin. They were almost there. The real fight was about to begin. Henry held up a fist, signaling for them to freeze. Peeking over the edge of the gully, he saw it, a small, sandbagged German outpost, manned by 3 soldiers, casually talking and smoking. Their backs were mostly to the gully, their attention fixed on the beach below, oblivious to the small band of Americans just yards away. This was their chance. With a silent gesture, Henry pointed to 2 of his men, indicating the German soldiers. He then pointed to himself, tapping his chest, and then sweeping his hand towards the 3rd German. The plan was simple, brutal, and had to be executed perfectly. No warning shots, no shouts, just swift action. He took a deep breath, gripped his rifle, and launched himself out of the gully. The element of surprise was everything. The attack was over in seconds. Henry moved like a phantom, his years of training kicking in. The German soldier he targeted barely had time to register what was happening before Henry was on him, a silent, efficient takedown. Behind him, his men, fueled by adrenaline and desperation, dealt with the other 2. There was no time for hesitation, no room for mercy. The outpost was secured, the immediate threat neutralized. They had breached the outer defenses. Breathing heavily, Henry quickly scanned the area. They had a small, crucial foothold on the bluff. This wasn't just a victory, it was a vantage point. From here, they could see more of the German positions, the network of trenches and machine gun nests that had been decimating their comrades on the beach. "All right," Henry whispered, his voice hoarse. "Fan out, but stay close. We need to expand this. Look for anything that looks like communication lines." He knew that simply taking out this one small outpost wasn't enough. They needed to sow chaos, disrupt the German command structure, and create a bigger opening. His eyes quickly darted to a thick cable running along the ground, partially buried. A telephone line. "Here!" he hissed, pointing. "Cut it. All of them. Anything that looks like it connects to their radios or other positions." One of his men, a young private named Miller, quickly pulled out his combat knife and began hacking at the cable. The satisfying snap of severed wires was a small but significant victory. As they moved cautiously, they encountered another small patrol. This time, the Germans were more alert. A quick, brutal firefight erupted, short but intense. They used the terrain to their advantage, surprising the Germans from unexpected angles. 2 more German soldiers went down, and the remaining ones, disoriented by the sudden assault from their flank, quickly retreated further inland, shouting warnings. This was good. Their presence was now known. But the confusion they created was invaluable. Henry knew they needed to signal the main forces. The naval bombardment was still hammering the bluffs, but it was largely ineffective against the well-entrenched positions. If they could get a signal, a sign that Americans were actually on the bluff and making progress, it could shift the entire battle. He spotted a tattered American flag, still clutched by a fallen soldier from another unit, just near the gully. A grim reminder of the cost of this invasion. He carefully retrieved it. "Miller," Henry said, "can you get this flag up somewhere visible? High up. Don't expose yourself more than you have to, but make it clear." Miller, still shaking from the recent skirmish, nodded grimly. He found a broken tree limb, makeshift flagpole, and began tying the flag to it. Henry watched, his heart pounding. It was a desperate act, a beacon of defiance amidst the destruction. He knew it was a huge risk, but if it worked, if anyone saw it, it could give hope to the men still trapped on the beach. He hoped someone was looking. He hoped someone would understand. They had broken the stalemate, but the fight was far from over. They had just opened a small bloody door, and now they had to keep it open. As Henry's group pushed further inland on the bluff, the German resistance grew stiffer, more organized. They weren't just encountering isolated patrols anymore. They were now actively fighting behind enemy lines deep within the German defensive network. The initial surprise advantage was fading, replaced by a brutal grind. Machine gun fire ripped through the air with renewed intensity, and mortar shells began to land closer, less random than before. The Germans were reacting, adapting to the breach. Henry's leadership became crucial in these intense skirmishes. He moved with a quiet urgency, his eyes constantly scanning, assessing, directing. He wasn't shouting orders. Instead, his commands were concise, almost whispered, yet every man understood. "Miller, cover the flank. Johnson, suppress that nest." He pointed with quick, decisive gestures. During one particularly fierce firefight, pinned down by a well-placed German machine gun, Henry spotted a small, overgrown trench leading around the enemy position. Without a word, he signaled two of his men, and they crawled through the dense undergrowth, emerging behind the machine gun nest. A burst of gunfire, a sudden silence, and the threat was neutralized. It was small, tactical victories like these, born from Henry's quick thinking and his men's trust, that kept them moving forward. They systematically targeted and neutralized specific German defenses that had been raining fire down on Omaha Beach. A concrete pillbox, seemingly impregnable from the beach, was taken out by a well-placed grenade after Henry identified a blind spot in its defenses. Another time, they silenced a mortar team by flanking their position, catching them completely off guard. Each successful action, each neutralized threat, was a small chip away at the German stronghold, a tiny spark of hope for the thousands still trapped below. The impact of their actions slowly but surely became visible on the beach. The relentless German fire, while still present, began to lessen in intensity. The machine gun nests that had been chattering non-stop for hours were now falling silent one by one. The mortar barrages became less frequent, less accurate. It wasn't a sudden cessation of fire, but a gradual, noticeable reduction. The men on the beach, initially shell-shocked and pinned, started to notice. They felt the slight easing of pressure, the brief lulls in the storm of bullets and explosions. From their position on the bluff, Henry could occasionally glimpse the beach through gaps in the trees and smoke. He saw movement. Small groups of American soldiers, emboldened by the reduction in fire, were beginning to stir. They were making desperate pushes, crawling over obstacles, moving with a renewed sense of purpose. It was a slow, agonizing process, but it was happening. The flag Miller had raised, though tattered and small against the vastness of the battlefield, must have been seen. It was a symbol, a promise that the bluffs were not impenetrable, that help was on the way from above. Henry knew this was far from over. They had opened a door, but the Germans would fight to close it. The bluffs were still swarming with enemy soldiers, and the fight for every yard was brutal. But the tide, however slowly, was beginning to turn. The stalemate on Omaha Beach, which had seemed unbreakable just hours ago, was finally being broken. And it was starting right here, with this small, determined group of men, led by a quiet sergeant who refused to give up. They had just opened a small, bloody door, and now they had to keep it open, because down on the beach, other units were finally beginning to advance. The small, hard-won victory on the bluff quickly gained momentum. Henry's group, having cleared several German positions, soon made contact with elements of the 1st Infantry Division. These were men who had endured the hell of the beach, finally managing to claw their way up a different, less defended draw. Inspired by the diminishing enemy fire and the sight of the American flag fluttering precariously on the bluff. The link-up was a moment of raw relief, a shared understanding of the impossible odds they had faced and overcome. There were no elaborate greetings, just grim nods and immediate coordination. "Sergeant Mitchell, glad to see you," a dust-covered lieutenant said, extending a hand caked with mud and grime. "Lieutenant Davies, what's your situation?" With the combined forces, they began the arduous task of consolidating their positions. The Germans, initially caught off guard by the American penetration, were now regrouping and counterattacking with increasing ferocity. Every bunker, every trench line, every patch of scrub brush became a battleground. Henry, despite the arrival of higher-ranking officers, continued to play a crucial role. His intimate knowledge of the terrain they had just fought through, his quick assessment of enemy strongpoints, and his calm demeanor under fire proved invaluable. He moved among the newly arrived troops, pointing out potential threats, suggesting flanking maneuvers, and helping to direct the flow of ammunition and reinforcements. His insights were often more accurate than those coming from maps drawn far from the actual fighting. He found himself guiding a squad of engineers to a stubbornly defended pillbox, showing them the exact angle from which to approach it, the blind spot he'd observed earlier. He helped coordinate overlapping fields of fire between newly established machine gun positions, turning the tables on the German defenders who had so effectively pinned them down hours before. The chaos was still immense, but it was now a controlled chaos, with a clear direction. The Americans were no longer just surviving. They were advancing. The tide had truly begun to turn. News from other sectors of Omaha Beach, though still grim, indicated similar breakthroughs. Small pockets of determined GIs, inspired by the easing of the relentless German fire, were making their own pushes, often finding gaps in the German defenses that Henry's actions had helped create. The beach, once a killing field, slowly transformed into a staging ground. More troops, more equipment, more supplies were now making it ashore, building up the strength needed to push inland. The initial impossible situation, the fear that the entire invasion might fail at Omaha, was slowly, agonizingly being overcome. Yet, even in this burgeoning victory, the cost was staggering. The ground beneath their feet was soaked with blood, littered with the bodies of both American and German soldiers. The air was thick with the smell of cordite, smoke, and something metallic and sickly sweet. Every face was etched with exhaustion, fear, and a profound weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. Henry saw young men, barely out of their teens, staring blankly into the distance, their eyes holding horrors no one should ever witness. He himself felt an ache in his bones that had nothing to do with physical exertion, a deep, internal tremor that spoke of the sheer brutality of what they had endured. He watched a medic tend to a screaming soldier, his leg shattered, and felt a familiar cold knot in his stomach. The success of their mission, the fact that they had broken the German line and were now pushing forward, did not erase the images of his own men cut down on the sand. It did not silence the screams he had heard or diminish the terror he had felt. Victory was a word for generals and historians. For the men on the ground, it was simply surviving another minute, another hour, with the knowledge that too many had not. They had achieved something monumental, but the price had been paid in blood, a debt that would linger for a lifetime. As the immediate battle for Omaha Beach wound down and the front lines pushed further inland, Sergeant Henry Mitchell, like so many others, found himself operating on pure adrenaline and a grim sense of duty. There was no time for celebration or even for processing the trauma. He helped organize the wounded for evacuation, directed incoming supplies, and assisted in securing the newly won positions on the bluffs. His exhaustion was bone deep, a heavy weight that settled in his muscles and mind. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had stared death in the face for hours and emerged, changed. He spoke little, his voice hoarse from shouting commands over the din of battle, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, still alert for any threat. He saw comrades fall into an exhausted sleep where they stood, only to be roused moments later for the next task. For Henry, there was only the next objective, the next duty, until he collapsed into a fitful slumber hours later, the sounds of battle still echoing in his ears. In the immediate aftermath, with the sheer scale of the D-Day invasion unfolding, individual acts of heroism like Henry's often got lost in the bigger picture. The focus was on the successful establishment of the beachhead, the coordination of thousands of troops, and the strategic gains. Official reports documented unit movements and casualty figures, but the specific, desperate actions of a sergeant rallying a handful of men to scale a bluff were easily overlooked amidst the overwhelming chaos. There were no war correspondents following Henry Mitchell with notebooks, no cameras capturing his pivotal moments. His name, if mentioned at all, was likely buried deep within a company report, a footnote in the grand narrative of Omaha Beach. Decades passed, and Henry Mitchell's story, like countless others, remained largely untold. He returned home after the war, a quiet man carrying invisible scars. He rarely spoke of D-Day, finding it difficult to articulate the horrors and the choices he made. The world moved on, celebrating generals and grand strategies, slowly forgetting the individual soldiers who truly turned the tide. There was no medal, no parade specifically for his actions that day. Perhaps he never sought it, content to have survived and to have done his part. His heroism was not of the kind that seeks fanfare. It was born of necessity, of an innate refusal to surrender to despair. Yet the importance of forgotten heroes, like Henry Mitchell, cannot be overstated. History often focuses on the overarching narratives, the big names, and the decisive battles. But it is the countless, unrecorded acts of courage, initiative, and self-sacrifice by ordinary individuals that truly shape events. Henry Mitchell serves as an archetype for these unsung heroes, the private, the corporal, the sergeant, who, in a moment of extreme crisis, makes a choice that ripples outwards, saving lives and altering the course of battle. He was not a general with a grand plan, but a soldier who saw a critical problem and found a way, however desperate, to solve it. Henry Mitchell's enduring legacy, though unheralded for so long, is profound. His courage, his tactical insight, and his ability to inspire a small group of terrified men literally saved countless lives that day on Omaha Beach. By breaking through the German defenses on the bluffs, he created the crucial breach that allowed the entire invasion to move forward. Without his actions, and the actions of others like him, the beachhead might have failed, potentially altering the entire trajectory of World War II. His story reminds us that, even in the face of overwhelming odds, the power of individual initiative, quiet determination, and unwavering resolve can change the course of history, one desperate act of bravery at a time. It's a testament to the fact that true heroism isn't always found in the spotlight, but often in the darkest, most terrifying moments, by those who simply refuse to give up.